All right, welcome everybody. Hello. For those who don't know me, my name is Beth Weinstein, and I'm an associate professor here at the University of Arizona in the School of Architecture, and chair this School of Architecture's Lecture and Events Committee, along with a wonderful team that includes faculty members Oscar Lopez, Eric Weber, and Bob Perkins, as well as two students, Hallie Letzinger and Alfredo Quesada. I want to welcome you to this semester's inaugural lecture for our spring series here at CAPLA. Before we get rolling, I want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. And today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Tohono O'odham and Yaqui people. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and Indigenous communities. And on behalf of CAPLA, and the CAPLA community, I pay my respects to these communities and their elders past and present. We are really pleased to gather creative and critical thinkers and makers of built environments from nearby and places far away to share their ideas and their work with our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and other friends wherever they happen to be. So before I pass the microphone to my colleague, Darley Adkins, who's going to introduce today's speaker, I'd like to inform you about the next couple of events that we have coming up, as you can see on the poster, which is hopefully on your screen. Next Monday, on Monday, the 7th of February, the School of Architecture is looking forward to welcoming Mabel Wilson, Professor of Architecture and African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Her lecture, titled "Can We Forget? A Memorial to Enslaved Laborers," will be held in person at the Center for Creative Photography at 5:30 p.m. And the following week, on Wednesday, February 16th, my colleague Lisa Schrank will speak on An Architect's Laboratory, the early studio of Frank Lloyd Wright. Her lecture will be held on Zoom, and you can find the link to register and more information about that and other upcoming events on our website, capla.arizona.edu, under News and Events. I now want to pass this microphone over to Associate Professor Darley Adkins, who's going to introduce our very special guest.
Thank you, Beth. So yes, my name is Darley Adkins. I'm an Associate Professor of Urban Planning and the Interim Director of the Transportation Research Institute at the University of Arizona. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Linda back to CAPLA and to the University of Arizona. She is currently an Associate Professor of Urban Design at the Sam Fox School of Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches architecture and urban design studios and seminars on urbanism, urban history, and theory, as well as alternative sustainability metrics. She's currently or recently a co-PI on a Mellon Foundation grant aimed at increasing social and environmental benefits of a multi-billion-dollar proposed Metrolink expansion in St. Louis. So she does research that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm especially excited to welcome Linda back here because she was one of the first faces that greeted me when I arrived at the University of Arizona. Hard to believe it was about 9 years ago now, almost 9 years ago. Linda was the director of the Sustainable City Project within CAPLA, a joint effort between CAPLA and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Linda and I had great fun co-teaching an interdisciplinary urban design studio that allowed, I think, Linda, safe to say, Linda to explore some of the topics that you're going to maybe be hearing about tonight and are certainly covered in the book. So it's been a real privilege to be able to work with Linda back then and over the years. And I'll also just say very briefly that I had the privilege of stopping in Los Angeles on my way to Tucson just a couple of weeks ago and was able to do a little walking tour along the LA River with Linda and get some insights into some very exciting infrastructure projects happening in that region. So back to Linda, she earned her doctorate in urban planning from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has a master's degree in architecture from Princeton University. When she was at UCLA, she was also a senior research associate for City Lab. And as we'll be hearing more tonight, her very recently published book from Routledge is called Infrastructural Optimism. I've gotten a sneak peek, and I would highly recommend the book. It's dealing with some absolutely critical issues facing our country and the world in terms of infrastructure and the future. So without further ado, welcome, Linda.
Thank you so much, Arlie, for that lovely introduction, and in advance for your participation in some of the work I'm going to share tonight and your contribution to the book. And thank you, Beth, for organizing such a rigorous lecture series. I'm excited to be even next to Mabel on the poster. I think it's going to be a great series. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. Get the thumbs up, make sure this works. Yep. Can everybody see this? Great. Thanks, Beth. I also just want to say a big hello to my former U of A colleagues, and I think some of the faculty and students who participated in some of these projects that you're going to see are in this Zoom room. So thank you all for coming back to see the next stages in the work. I want to start actually by talking about optimism, which might not be the sentiment that we are all having at the moment for many reasons. And I want to go back to the day that I sent off the massive PDF that is this book project. And I remember this day very clearly, not just because it was sort of the end of a 10-year broad effort and a 5-year focused effort and a 1.5-year frantic effort, but it was April 20th, 2021, and I looked out the window of my house in St. Louis, and it was snowing. And from Arizona or from California, where I am currently, that might just seem like an abstract thought, but the final frost day in St. Louis is actually April 1st. So the fact that it was snowing on April 20th in St. Louis is odd. And not only was it odd that it was snowing outside, and it snowed for a good 24 hours at the end of April. But it was also a moment where I began to reflect on all of the other things around me that were different about this particular moment in time. So I'd sent off this PDF, and this project had gone through 3 presidential administrations. So to say that it had had some high points of optimism and perhaps some lower points of optimism is certainly true. It had been through a Great Recession, a near depression, the snow at the end of April that I just mentioned. And of course, we were at the beginning of a pandemic wave, the likes of which none of us had probably ever imagined. And I was super fortunate that I had been vaccinated early in this process. So late January, early February, I got vaccinated at WashU. But the day I turned in the book, I was sick. And I was like, oh, it's just allergies, I'm vaccinated, right? But the day after I turned in the book, I tested positive for COVID. And I was the first breakthrough case I had ever heard of. And I was the first breakthrough case I think many people have ever heard of. And yet here I was, like, getting ready to preach the gospel of optimism. So this personal colliding of circumstances, as I reflect on it now and even right after, of course, was a microcosm of the more universal colliding of circumstances that we were all going through in some way or another. The pandemic, global climate change, ravaging wealth disparity, the swell of social uprising that had really started to take root in a way that it hadn't before, political uncertainty, even instability in our democracy, and yet, optimism persists. So I wanted to quote Al Gore. I quote him in the book because I find this quote just sort of amazing. I always come down on the side of hope. Now, Al Gore has many, many reasons to not be optimistic. He did not say this right after he lost his presidential race, which was reason enough not to be optimistic. He said this just after the 2016 election, just after the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. I always come down on the side of hope. In the face of this major step backwards in one of his signature achievements, Gore cited the rising agency of city mayors and state governors to fill the gap where our federal government was failing, and the dropping prices of PV solar panels and of electric battery storage as proof that a renewable future was getting closer, right? He is not the only one who uses the concepts and the theories and the emotions and the objectives of optimism to keep his message going, to keep this idea going that we deserve and that we can plan for a better future. Optimism, very broadly, is the belief in a better future. Personal optimism is the individual belief, so for yourself, your career, your own goals, in your own better future. But collective optimism, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit more here, is the belief in a better future for all of us together, a better future for society, a better future for all of society. And this is the important kind of optimism when we talk about design of our shared built environment, design of our commons. Infrastructural optimism is based broadly on a concept that everyone deserves to believe in a better future for themselves, their children, the planet, but mostly a better collective future. And that our collective investments in infrastructure, which is our largest public space, our commons, our shared resources, how we access and distribute them, the very basis of our quality of life, should be contributing to that better future for all of us rather than detracting from it. That is what I think infrastructural optimism is, this collective idea. And for everyone who's thinking about like, how do I own this? I ask that we collectively imagine this idea, that we collectively produce through our design work, but also through advocating for policy, negotiating property rights, setting priorities and values, who we work for and who we work with, how and why we take those jobs, that the future we collectively produce should improve the social, environmental, and economic outcomes. So how do we do this? How do we produce a better future at the scale of ecologies, taking into account what small part of the built environment we engage? So one way I talk about producing infrastructural optimism is through infrastructural opportunism. And infrastructural opportunism is this concept that we should be leveraging the trillions of dollars going into infrastructure investment, particularly these two massive federal bills, assuming both of them go through, not just for maintenance or generic efficiencies, though of course we're 75 years behind on our maintenance, but for added social and environmental benefits. And this is also what I call shifting from the red arrow to the green arrow scenario. The red arrow is really last generation infrastructure. It is resource intensive, it is spatially and socially disruptive, it is often environmentally damaging, and it typically does one thing at a time and sometimes not so well. Next generation infrastructure contributes to the reduction of these damages and divides. It recognizes infrastructure as a public amenity, it reintroduces systems-based thinking into city design and planning, and it utilizes interdisciplinary design thinking to improve quality of experience. So what do I mean by next generation infrastructure? Well, this concept emerged while I was a senior research associate at UCLA's City Lab, and I was co-planning with Dana Cuff, Roger Sherman, and Tim Higgins, the WPA 2.0 Working Public Architecture Design Competition. WPA 2.0 was a call for innovative design-based solutions that would be worthy of a national level effort to revitalize cities and put the public back in public works. That was sort of our formal call for people to enter the competition. And this was a moment in time, this was 2007, on the verge of 2008, where the conditions that were existing in the world were really a perfect storm of conditions that called us to create this competition. So 2000 to 2010 is what I call the disaster decade. So tragic and highly visible infrastructure collapses were covered by the media, were more evident and more shocking than they had been to us in the past. Post-Hurricane Katrina, the collapse of the levees and the deaths that were suffered in that terrible disaster. The American Society of Civil Engineers rated us an overall D average in our infrastructure scores. We have now gone up to a D+, which is pitiful. The Great Recession was coming, right? We were on the verge of the Great Recession. So in our own fields, in our design and construction fields, we reached sometimes up to 40% of unemployment. The economic crisis in the US as a result of this Great Recession was responded to by the Obama administration by the ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And as part of our goal at City Lab, we said, well, what do we think architects, urban designers, and landscape architects and urban planners should be doing to help guide this money? We don't want it to go to now popular phrase, shovel ready. We want to go to shovel worthy projects. We were also beginning to quantify and account for environmental accountability in our professions in ways we hadn't before. So the invention of LEED or efforts like the Chicago mayoral efforts to green roofs. These were all sort of new in our profession in this era. At the same time, we were growing our social accountability. Architects have not been known in particular for having a lot of interest in necessarily putting social efforts first. So Architecture for Humanity came around in this era, and competitions like their global competition for refugee housing, which attracted attention all over the globe for how design might provide new forms of housing. Pitch Africa, which is one of my favorite projects. It's a soccer field, but it's also a water harvesting system, a cistern, and underneath all this, an HIV and AIDS clinic for women who might not want their sons or their partners to know that they're getting treatment. Lastly, we had model projects emerge. So the High Line, we all know, is extremely well known and is successful. Good and bad results. But this romanticized relic became a real reinvention of infrastructure as a form of public space. So we can look at those kinds of models. And then lastly, which is important to us as designers, the urbanism discourse began to shift. So we were seeing a shift away from what I call the pessimism of the 1980s and 90s and kind of neoliberal era, the postmodern city, and we were moving towards new kinds of responses to privatization and sprawl. And these responses were primarily in three schools of thought: everyday urbanism, landscape urbanism, and new urbanism. And of course, their progeny that spawned since those early 2000s. Rather than going into sort of the aspects of and defining all of these, which is a class in itself, which I teach, I want to talk about how they informed our next steps in terms of getting to infrastructural urbanism. So from everyday urbanism, we pull this idea of the right to the city. We also pull ideas about participation, who deserves a voice and agency in that conversation. We look at multi-scalar economies and combining formal and informal ways to contribute to those multi-scalar economies. From landscape urbanism, and perhaps more specifically from ecological urbanism, it pulls ideas of ecological performance, how natural systems thinking can combine with synthetic systems thinking, and how we might consider cross-system symbiosis. And then lastly, from new urbanism, we pull the idea of reprioritizing placemaking in public space. So if postmodern urbanism was characterized by projects such as the internally facing anti-urban Bonaventure Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, product of the 70s, and popularized by authors like Michael Sorkin, scholars like Michael Sorkin, and other writings by people like Ed Soja, who really dubbed this era the death of public space. This is when our public spaces in downtowns were sanitized, militarized, thematized. They were monopolized by corporate plazas, generic commercial developments. If that was kind of what we were emerging from in the 80s or 90s, the 2000s took a decidedly more inclusive and optimistic bent. And infrastructural urbanism in particular is one that I want to point out. Generally, though, we started to think about the city as a place that could be integrated rather than segregated. And this is systems, people, humans, and non-humans. It could be networked rather than autonomous. It could be inclusive rather than elitist, flexible rather than rigid, cross and multidisciplinary, bottom up as well as top down, ecological as well as economical, and outcome driven rather than just object focused. So the city became a space of a performative kind of space. So these 6 factors, the infrastructural, economic, and environmental crises, the rise of consciousness from the design professions around social and environmental responsibility, and this change in the urbanism discourse really defined this moment in 2007 when we began planning the WPA 2.0 competition. So the competition was a global competition. We had over 320 entries, combination of student-led and combined teams, professional-led teams of all disciplines. Many were interdisciplinary. From the competition, we had 5 finalists and 1 winner. And the assessment of these, particularly the finalists and the winner, was what led me to the development of the first 7 next generation infrastructure criteria. And these 7 criteria I want to go over kind of briefly just to touch on. But next generation infrastructure is multifunctional, right? We can no longer afford to invest in any single system that does one thing at a time only. It is also public, it is inclusive, it is incorporates engagement, and it celebrates difference, but it is also civic. So it is the place where difference can occur and where politics could actually happen. It is visible. So we are able to see our resource consumption and our infrastructural processes to promote accountability and responsibility for personal consumption and for our shared impact on the commons. It is socially productive. So next generation infrastructure increases rather than decreases equity by providing new amenities, access, and opportunities while decreasing negative impacts. It is locally specific, flexible, and adaptable. It is sensitive to the eco-economy, so it recognizes the interconnected complexity of economic and ecological systems together. And it is driven by design so that we are always thinking about occupation, supporting quality of life, and it can also serve as experiments and prototypes. So after these 7, I began to apply them to the work that I did with students at the University of Arizona. So Arley's familiar with these, and with students that I then began to work with at Washington University, and they led really to 4 additional next-gen criteria. So successful next-gen criteria is symbiotic. The byproducts of one process can be used as the fuel for another, and that reduces resource use and waste. They're technologically smart. So next-gen infrastructure includes technology to improve system performance, safety, and access, and particularly in service of all of the other criteria together. They are developed collaboratively across disciplines and agencies. So next-gen infrastructure begins to break down silos to find new opportunities for creative solutions. And it operates at micro and macro scales. So that accommodates an array of contingencies, increases resilience and adaptability, and provides opportunities for symbiosis at many levels. And I actually think this is one of the most important criteria we started to see during the pandemic. So looking at the finalists from the WPA 2.0 competition, when I was preparing the book, we went back and we took these 11 criteria and began to make sure that we could see how these projects actually accomplish their goals through these criteria. An amazing part of this research was going back and talking to all these teams. So what you see in the book is their original proposals, which I'm showing here, and then the work that they have done in the 10 years since they entered the competition. All of them have done really interesting and relevant work. Most of them have produced books that support that work and produced projects that support that work. Fascinatingly, though, this is the only project which has actually been built, and it was one of my favorite entries into the competition. This is Ron Rael's, Rael San Fratello Architects, Border Wall as Infrastructure. And their original proposal was 26 different ways to intervene in the border wall between the US and Mexico. And many of you probably saw the installation that went viral of the video of Ron running up to the border, putting in the teeter-totter, and they actually had people on both sides of the wall riding the teeter-totter for up to 40 minutes. So I love this project. It's an outcome of the WPA 2.0 competition. So how do we get these next-gen criteria, next-gen infrastructure projects to happen? And I talk about 3 strategies. And these 3 strategies are what we have to do to shift the paradigm. We have to broaden the process, we have to transform the prototype, and we have to measure what matters. So what do I mean by that? By broadening the process, I mean we have to incorporate a wider range of stakeholders, bring designers of all types in early, spread power to local residents, and work across agencies and disciplines to break down silos. we have to measure what matters. And this is one of the newer ones for me and one of the most interesting things I think I'm working on right now. So we have to stop thinking about growth for the sake of growth and economic development as the ultimate end game. This is kind of radical for people who focus on economic development. We have to differentiate good dollars from bad dollars. So the diagram you see on the right is GPI, Genuine Progress Indicators, and it is an alternative to GDP, gross domestic product. GPI measures good dollars and bad dollars, but it also recognizes and accounts for the cost of loss. So losing air quality, losing animal habitat, but also things like the loss of social cohesivity. And then it counts the value of gains that are generally hard to measure, like volunteering or working from the home, or all of these things we've really identified in the pandemic that we didn't realize other people were doing that we now were taking on ourselves. So it takes into account qualitative as well as quantitative measures. And then the third strategy is transforming the prototype. So we have to stop designing 20th century infrastructure because we refer to status quo, existing controlled prototypes, right? We have to move away from solutions that are obsolete, unsustainable, and unrealistic. We have to seek bigger goals beyond efficiencies of service, and we have to incorporate next generation infrastructure criteria. And one way is just to think about bundling and symbiosis. Co-location is sort of the bottom, best solution, multifunctionality, and then symbiotic relationships. So I want to share the two case studies that I use in the book. They both emerged out of work that I did with other faculty and students. The I-11 super corridor started at U of A in that interdisciplinary studio that Arlie was referring to. We were extremely fortunate to get a lot of support from the Walton Sustainable Solutions Initiative at ASU and the Renewable Energy Network at U of A. And so that allowed this project to go on for about a year. So this is not just one studio's work, in case you're a student out there thinking, oh my God. And then the other project, so the I-11 project is a big project in the Southwest, covering 500 miles. And the main challenges of that project are really environmental. The St. Louis project is the North Side, South Side Metrolink, and that's about a 17-mile project. And the challenges in St. Louis are as dire, but they're mostly social challenges. So if we think about the project in the Southwest, the I-11 project, like I said, we had a lot of different collaborators, but it was actually a 3-university relationship also. So we at U of A worked with ASU and worked with UNLV, and the stretch of I-11 that we worked on was about 480 miles. Our red arrow to green arrow scenario was this. If you're going to build a road and it's going to cost between $17 to $75 million per lane per mile, then you should do something more than just building a flattened black freeway. It's what they called it at ADOT. And the primary argument, so this is a map of that site, gives you some sense that I-11 goes from the Nogales, the border of Arizona with Mexico, to Las Vegas. And one of the arguments is that Las Vegas to Phoenix are two of the largest cities in the US that do not have an interstate connecting them currently. So if you drive that route, you know that. These were the 12 sites we looked at primarily. And like most freeways, in addition to that little segment that was missing, the argument is often to accommodate growth and to encourage growth. So you can see how these are kind of inherently conflicting. One of the things we wanted to do at the very beginning was to think about this segment of freeway quite differently. And we were really lucky that ADOT, in its corridor justification report, said right up front, we have the ambition to do something different here. And ADOT was one of our partners in the project, which is sort of amazing. You think of an interstate freeway building organization in a relatively conservative state that they wouldn't necessarily be saying, hey, we want to do something different. So in their corridor justification report, this is a quote from there, they already were saying, we want this to be multimodal. We want to have infrastructure bundling. We want this to be a smart or green corridor of the future. So we got together with our planning group in particular that was in our studio, and we said, okay, our first mission is to debunk the initial argument that lanes are needed to accommodate traffic in this instance, and that all growth is good growth. And so you can see the math that we did here with the help of Mike Chester at ASU and our experts in-house. And we said, okay, if we shift the development that's coming, if we shift it from a sprawl growth model to a smart growth model, so more walkable, more multimodal, more higher density. If we increase inter and inner city transit based on the projections that ADOT was already supporting, and Tucson was building a modern streetcar, which we now know is done and up and running and certainly successful in its own right, and shift some of that movement to light rail or other forms of transit. If we increase electric vehicles just 1%, and if we move 10% of truck freight to rail, then we could save 2.1 million metric tons of CO2 emissions per year. And that's before we design anything. So part of the effort here in the whole measuring what matters concept is to speak the language of people who are making these kinds of decisions so that they can look at this information and understand the value of what we're proposing. So we did quite a bit of analysis, and I won't share much of it with you. Many of you certainly are more expert in the Arizona landscape than I am, at least in the current up-to-date landscape. But we looked at a lot of big picture information. Of course, two things, in addition to population and traffic growth, which were kind of represented here. We know population and traffic are growing, but what we've learned recently is they're not growing as fast as as other projections said. So population and traffic growth is less than anticipated, but the potential for solar is extremely high. And right now, the solar, the amount of energy that's used in Arizona that is produced through solar is, I think it's around 8% currently. The other thing we know is that it takes a lot of power to move water, and it takes a lot of water to make power. So this energy water nexus, but we move a lot of water in Arizona. So 336 miles of the cap, and that water is moving our Colorado River allocation to provide water to the state of Arizona. So these two things were priorities: capitalize on solar energy and think about the issues of water. So I'm just going to show you two case studies of projects and kind of set the picture of sort of what kind of work we did. So this first one is Smart Energy City. These were teams of planning students, landscape architecture students, and architecture students. This project was in Tucson at the intersection of where the future I-11 would be. And in Tucson, it aligns with I-10 unless it goes through Avra Valley, which is obviously a conversation currently. This project was the moment where I-10 and I-11 were aligned and Congress Street was crossing. And so the new streetcar, it's probably not new anymore to you guys, the streetcar was intersecting that location. So Energy City is really all about maximizing renewable energy production, solar, wind, and kinetic, and creating a renewable energy industry hub at this intersection. It also maximizes water harvesting from rain and air conditioning condensate for river recharge to improve animal habitat and create microclimates. It connects to high-speed transit that runs along the whole line in our proposed future, and in this case connects to the modern streetcar. And in the end, with each of these projects, we went back and we said, okay, if we want to measure what matters when we put all this stuff together, what does that look like? So we started to say how much energy, and this is, this really was done during the semester. So how do you figure out how much energy was produced, how much water was harvested, and what that means? That was the Tucson case. The second case is Marana, which most of you know is right up the road. And Marana benefits from having quite a bit of water allocation from the CAP because it's formerly agricultural. So the history of this site really made it a primary site between the CAP, the new I-11, and the railroad, plus these remnant water rights, to be a site for a full-scale laboratory and sustainable development. The idea was to enhance educational offerings springing from a local community college that was already there, to teach about sustainable agriculture, hydrology, and ecology, to use the land as a gray water filter, to create a new tech industry around, again, that high-speed rail, and to create sustainably focused green ecosystems of live, work, and play. And in this project, we also produced a results diagram. And you can see this project is primarily about energy production and water harvesting for recreational use, and then both go to supporting this like educational hub. In the end, we sort of added this all together. So we had the benefits from the behavioral and modal shifts we talked about in the beginning, and then added to those the idea that plus that, we would have all of this new renewable energy production, water harvesting, smart industries, et cetera, et cetera. The second case, the St. Louis case, as I mentioned, has same kind of level of conditions that we're responding to, but it's a really different kind of case and a really different kind of place. We got a grant from the Divided Cities grant, the Mellon Foundation at WashU, to support this project that we called Mobility for All by All. And you can see by this diagram, we also had a hugely interdisciplinary team partnering, and in both cases, we're partnering with actual officials working on these actual projects in the actual cities. So ADOT, Sonoran Institute in Arizona, and in St. Louis, we were partnering with the Bi-State Regional Planning Organization and the people building the Metrolink. So I want to give you a little bit of information on St. Louis to set the stage. This project originated from a desire to assure that this coming investment in St. Louis's light rail expansion, which is going to be up to $2 billion, is more than just an expensive train, because there's a lot of need in St. Louis. The project really, though, is based on this idea of what is its social justice potential. So this graphic gives you the sense at the bottom, the sort of peak of St. Louis population, which was very early in around 1940 at 856,000. Population in St. Louis right now in the city is around 306,000. So even that 311, even that 308,604, we have dropped below it in the last census, in the 2020 census. So it is a city with a dropping population. The new line would go north-south, as you can see on this diagram, and the north side of the city and the south side of the city are where the most disinvestment has happened. The most investment has happened along the east-west side. These are some of the data points for the city of St. Louis. So poverty is higher in the north side, around 42%, and 36% of households don't have vehicles. So the need is quite high in terms of bringing investment to the north side of the city. The total median housing value in the north side of the city is about $59,000. The reason this is so low is partially because of the disinvestment through city practices, but also through bad characters that have come in and bought up property and let that property degrade and not fulfilling the promises they've made for redevelopment in the city. This is one of the most shocking data points, and I think many cities have been paying attention to this recently, which is life expectancy. So there's about a 17-year difference between the very highest life expectancy in West County and the lowest life expectancy in North St. Louis City. So that ranges from 87 to about 70. Why that happens, there are many, many, many factors. Environmental degradation is one among them. Lack of access to opportunity, lack of access to jobs, lack of access to medical care. And these, of course, are all being exacerbated at the moment in the pandemic. So we spent a lot of time in this course doing a lot of mapping. And so rather than going into great depth about each of the maps, I do want to point out a couple of key features. So this map shows what is technically considered vacancy, right? All the red pieces on this map are vacant property. Now we know vacancy is not vacant. People lived here, communities were built here. There are remnants of built projects, but also of lives and of contaminants in these same properties. But nearly 60%, that 60% population drop has left a tremendous amount of vacant properties in North St. Louis. The map on the right is also particularly interesting because it's a cumulative map. The darker the red, the more destruction and degradation by things like segregation, urban renewal, or racial covenants have happened in those areas. So if you're familiar at all, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that number 8 is the location of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. And that site has been cleared and re-cleared several times for the relocation of people in that community. The site just above it, number 3, is the site of the new National Geospatial Agency. And I'll show you some images of that towards the end. But these 2 sites have been the product of generations of community clearing and displacement. So this red shows the sort of need in these North St. Louis neighborhoods. We looked at power and influence. So what is the structure? What is the governmental structure? And how is that affecting the way things like tax increment financing is being distributed unevenly throughout the city of St. Louis? We looked at questions of environmental justice. So on the right, you see a map of high concentrations of lead, and this is measured in water in school buildings. And on the left, you see the yellow area, which is part of the EPA's consent decree for the city of St. Louis to deal with its combined sewer and stormwater overflow. So that means if you have a flooding condition and your stormwater and sewer are connected and you have flooding in your neighborhood, you might get sewer backed up into your yard or into your house. This is a map about opportunity corridors. Where is that investment happening and not happening? So the yellow circles are where tax increment financing investment is occurring. You can see that's all along the east-west corridor in the center area of the city. But the blue are things like HUD choice neighborhoods, federal promise zones. So those are places where federal government has identified need for investment, not where the investment is actually happening. So we identified 4 sites along the new North Side, South Side Metrolink expansion that would be key sites for us to take on in studio. And each student, there were pairs of students, had 2 stops and a segment, basically a segment of the North Side, South Side between those. They were given the next generation infrastructure criteria. Obviously, we had the research from the maps, and I'm just going to show you a little bit about each of the projects. This was a student who decided to not have a team member, and his project, Old North New Refuge, was about thinking about the north part of the city as a new area for international relocation. We have a lot of immigrants that come to St. Louis, and there's an international center in South St. Louis, so this would be kind of a duplicate in North St. Louis as a way to provide opportunities for people to relocate and be on the transit line for access to jobs and services for relocating immigrants. Karst Urbanism is a project in the southern part of the city. And the Karst landscape is the reason why St. Louis is known for its beer. So that's the underground cave landscape that remains cool. So Anheuser-Busch, for example, located along the river and used the caves as a way to keep their beer cool. But that landscape, when refrigeration came along, is not really used anymore. So this project actually looks at how that landscape can create a water economy by supporting small and large businesses that are based in reclaiming that water infrastructure. And you'll notice each of these projects is assessed based on the next generation criteria in these diagrams. Two Rivers looks at this relationship between the Mississippi River as one river and Interstate 55 as a second sort of pseudo river, and how these two resources come together. The project focuses on the remediation of lead in contaminated soils. So it reuses the river barges as a place to store and remediate that soil. And then once that soil is remediated, it introduces it back into the land for the production of healthy foods. And the project provides access to the water and other natural amenities that are currently cut off from housing and communities. And then this last project, Thrive at the Convergence, is again back up on the north side. And the idea of this project was to really capitalize on all the amazing history of North St. Louis. So there are dozens of people, musicians, athletes, from Tina Turner to Chuck Berry, who were born and grew up in North St. Louis. And they're not often known as being from North St. Louis. Even if they are identified in the city, they're sometimes identified on that east-west corridor where there might be statues to their presence. So This brings back that as a piece of the cultural history of the city, but also talks about how a new kind of economy, an education-based economy, can come in and support growth in North City. We are actually having a sort of amazing moment in North St. Louis, where one of the famous high schools where many of these future artists went to school is in the process of being revitalized, and about 10 arts organizations in the city are coming together to make a brand new, like, arts focused high school, not just for people who perform and do the art, but stage hands, scene designers, like anything that would support the arts, which is sort of an amazing moment. And then in studio, we've started trying again to bring projects together and to talk about how we can apply the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, to these projects. We entered I teach the Master of Urban Design studio. We were part of the 2021 Green New Deal SuperStudio that the Landscape Architecture Foundation sponsored. And one of the things we did was to, like I said, put these projects together and say, well, how are we accomplishing both the goals of GPI and how those overlap with the Green New Deal? Of course, 2020 kind of changed our social landscape rather radically. And even though this image is from 2017, I wanted to show it because there's a real importance to things like protest in the space of infrastructure, because our infrastructure is often our space of commerce that allows us to connect goods to people. And the cutting off of our infrastructure is often one way to control the relationships that we build through our commercial capitalism. So this was a protest in 2017 where protesters shut down Highway 40 in St. Louis after Jason Stockley was found not guilty in the murder of Anthony Lamar Smith. Obviously, we have begun to think about the presence of Black lives in our cities in ways we hadn't been. You know, we still have a very long way to go. And when I think about the 11 criteria, I think they are significant, but as we were reminded in the summer of 2020, benefits and opportunities supported or thwarted by our infrastructure are not equally distributed. And we are still very much reckoning, I think, with that uneven and highly contested production of the spaces where we live. And infrastructure is often one of our largest offending products. So though we are boldly and visibly taking back space in the name of marginalized populations, it's only one step. So this is the NGA site I told you I was gonna show you a bit about. The Pruitt-Igoe site is down here to the south. So this was the site of 21 skyscrapers to give you some sense of the scale. In case you think that, you know, urban renewal is not happening these days, large scale displacement is not happening these days, you can see how this site was just holding on. The last few multi-generational houses in 2016, they started to be cleared. By 2017, they were cleared. And by 2018, this is the site that we have in North St. Louis. It is 3 times roughly, I think, the size of the site of Pruitt-Igoe, and it will hold 3 buildings in the middle. One, the headquarters of the National Geospatial Agency, which is a federal level agency that does a lot of our drone work, and 2 parking garages. The rest of the site will be surrounded by a security buffer, which no one will be allowed to cross without certain clearances. So the contribution to the neighborhood, though they've been touting the contribution in terms of taxes, when we actually calculated the taxes, we were in the billions of dollars of deficit. When you calculate the cost of human displacement, of businesses, of social ties that we don't know how to put a dollar figure to, those costs are immeasurable. So I have added a 12th next generation criteria because I think next gen infrastructure must also repair the damage done and the violence caused to populations, human and non-human, and communities that have been oppressed, abused, or erased from the lands where we build and hope to build. And this new criterion, number 12, is reparative. Next generation infrastructure must also be reparative. So beyond being socially productive, Reparations must reprioritize resources, add agency, and create optimism for those who have been most impacted by institutionalized structures of racism, erasure, and exclusion. It must bring once silenced voices to the head of the table and create infrastructure that creates a better future for all and by all. So I think the big takeaways, just to kind of wrap up: broaden the process, transform the prototype, measure what matters, right? Those are kind of the three I explained the most. But our biggest challenges are climate change, wealth inequity, and stubborn dysfunction. I think the little bits of opportunities we have right now are the pandemic shocks to the system, right? We're seeing things change that we thought were immovable, that we thought were not possible. Another opportunity is the relationship between synthetic and natural systems. And, you know, we need to give a lot of credit to our landscape urbanism and ecological urbanism peers and our infrastructural urbanism peers, right? We're beginning to look at the city as a system again and creating opportunities for symbiosis. I think we have to be active about our federal infrastructure funding and create activism around where that money goes. And I think we have to think about how initiatives like the Green New Deal can come together with public-private partnerships to take big risks that government can't take on its own. And all of those things, I'm hoping, shift the paradigm and create investment in collective optimism. And I would love to open it up and have a discussion.
Thank you. And Linda, that was wonderful. And I will jump in with a quick comment and question here. I really appreciate the addition of your 12th criterion there. And I think that I was going to ask you specifically about housing, but you answered my question to some degree. But I wanted to just share, while you were talking, I looked up your old home in Tucson on Zillow.
Yeah.
And apparently when you lived here, Zillow says it was worth around $300,000. It's worth today $670,000 according to Zillow. And this is a beautiful old home, not terribly large, but right across the street from the new streetcar, a new streetcar stop in Tucson. So I think that you're absolutely right to put your finger on that being something really important that people who are thinking about infrastructure need to be thinking about, and thinking about, even though housing typically is thought of as a private good, the role of housing in these conversations about infrastructure. So I appreciate you bringing that in.
Yeah, and of course, I'm in Los Angeles now, and housing prices are unbelievable here. And I was just reading this morning about the escalating price of rents, and thinking about how poorly we have implemented protections for renters in this country, and how little we do to help people stay in their homes rather than, going through eviction. I mean, I think the eviction project that Matthew Desmond has been working on is pretty phenomenal. Yeah. It emerged from his book, and he's gone on to create a center around efforts to create policy to reduce eviction. And I mean, keeping people in the place where they already are seems a sort of logical first step to trying to combat an increasing problem of homelessness.
Yeah. And I think, it's very quite normal when we're talking about light rail lines and things like that to be spending $1 billion, $2 billion on these light rail lines, sometimes considerably more. Mm-hmm. And I think, something I've been writing about recently that I would love to see how it fits in with some of your work is, what would that look like if that had to be accompanied by an additional $1 billion in housing and making sure that housing remains affordable. And that's not beyond our capacity in this country. We can do that. We just need to be thinking about things differently and in a more connected way. So
yeah, completely agree. I mean, I didn't talk about things like community benefit agreements, but I remember visiting Toronto not long ago, and one of the measures, no, this might have been Vancouver. I think this was Vancouver. One of the measures they have in place is if you get, there's so few properties left, right? There's so few lots left to build on, and it's in such demand. If you get the privilege of being able to contribute in the private development sector, then you have the responsibility to contribute to that public sector, right? It is a codependency. They are interrelated. You don't get to choose those things separately.
That's a great segue to a question that Robert Miller posed in the chat, which is, how do you foresee achieving civic cooperation in order to get our society behind these proposals? Great talk, by the way. Thank you, he says.
Thank you, Rob. So there are a lot of people who want to participate in the civic conversation and are excluded in that conversation. So one of the components of the Mobility for All by All project was, how do we test out alternative forms of engagement? And, there is the historical ladder of participation, which is token engagement, where you just tell people what you're doing and you ask them to nod or check a box, right? And that goes all the way up to distributing power, where people who live in neighborhoods, residents who are invested often multi-generationally in a neighborhood, get the opportunity to make decisions, to be at the table. And in the Mobility for All by All project, we got a little tiny bit of money. I often say it was a $200,000 project that we did for $20,000. And we gave that money to community arts organizations to design their own community engagement projects with primarily youth in the neighborhood. So that ranged anywhere from like 8-year-olds to 18-year-olds, because these projects are long, right? There are 52 more projects. And these are people who are going to be writing these projects in, the beginnings of these projects in 15 to 20 years. And so one group did a project where they went on buses and they interviewed people, and then they created music out of those interviews. One group did a project where they sewed quilts that reflected the future of transit, and then they actually were trained to sew, and it became also kind of like an economic development opportunity for them. So we were trying to show the city, like you have to go to people and entrust people who live in places to talk about the needs in their neighborhood. So that's one way. But I think also there's another project in St. Louis called the Brickline Greenway. And the Brickline Greenway is, it was a competition, and we entered the competition and we were shortlisted, and we said, you can't just go east-west, like you can't go money to money. This Greenway has to go north-south. And so we influenced the competition to demand a north-south route. And there was a team of artists in St. Louis who said, and you need artists of color represented in the decision-making process. So who was providing feedback to the decision-making process changed. So that panel, that artist of color panel, has stayed a part of the participation in that process, and they're making decisions for what kind of artwork happens. And part of what they're doing is reclaiming the history of that north side of St. Louis. So I think you have to give people a platform and support them in that platform, and often they will come if their voices are praised, prioritized.
So I really loved your last point, number 12. Was very happy to see that, because I think this question of repair and reparations interpreted broadly is a real issue for our times. And we don't have a long tradition of repair, and yet we have conservation, preservation, adaptive reuse, but how to think about the maintenance, not only of the built, but also the social fabric that goes along with that. And as you're saying, the voices. So I'm wondering if you have already begun to kind of strategize like other ways of thinking about repair and reparations. For me, one of the things that comes to mind is Yoko Ono's practice of fixing the broken bowls with gold leaf and things like that. So how do we in fact make the reparation the most beautiful thing in what we make?
Yeah, there's a word for that. I don't know the word for it, of that, for that art, right? The gold leaf in the cracks. So a couple of things, you know, there are highway removal, highway cap, highway stitching projects happening all over the country. And there's some risk with those, right? They could further gentrify some areas where there is pressure to make those things happen. They could also create opportunities for economic development just by creating new property that ends up in the hands of people who are already wealthy and powerful, right? So how we do those projects right, I think is a big question. I'm super excited about a project I'm working on in LA, and I'll just give a little tiny bit about it, but it's, I'm working with the city and the Bureau of Engineering on what we're calling an equity indicators scorecard. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is, like, how do we begin to determine where we need to invest to better equalize the playing field? So there are neighborhoods that have been disinvested, obviously, for generations. And if we're thinking about stormwater infrastructure, if we're thinking about sidewalks, if we're thinking about tree canopy, we have to measure what's lacking, right? We have to measure, we have to understand the existing condition. We have to measure what's lacking so that we can figure out ways to invest in the neighborhoods that need it most. And we're beginning to research what cities are doing this now. You know, who's doing this well, who's making the effort. And we're partnering with a bunch of really interesting tech companies too. So we've started talking to people like Esri, who you know, is the distributor of ArcGIS. They have a new racial equity arm. So what's going to happen in that racial equity arm, where Esri starts to participate in the lives of cities and help city agencies track equity, right? There's a lot of initiatives coming from government, coming down from governments that are progressive, who want to see how equity is going to happen in their cities. So to your question, Beth, I think part of it is that the designers have to be involved in that conversation, right? Landscape architects, urban designers, urban planners, like, as well as partnering with engineers and ecologists and agriculture, people who do agriculture. Like, there's a lot of conversation around breaking silos. I think someone has their hand up.
Yeah, Naya?
Hi, I just wanted to ask, to point 4 of social productivity, how, in your opinion, do you think that's changed now in a post-pandemic world, which the ways in which we are socially productive are heavily reliant on there being a lot of space between us, which also takes down on collaboration and other things that might contribute to that factor? So what, in your opinion, would be a good approach to dealing with those conflicting conditions now?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, you know, I wasn't expecting a pandemic when I started this, but I will say, if you're going to be doing anything, writing a book, it's one of the good things to do in a pandemic, because it's one of those things you do by yourself often, though I have a great team also. I ended up writing a chapter that was, because I couldn't write anything else, right? I had to say, well, what's happening right now? What's going on in our cities? And what are the opportunities? And you know, the thing that is most apparent is the reduction in car space and the increase in people space. So we saw a lot of it's kind of expansion of the parklet concept, right? Take back space, take back street space for people who need more space to occupy. It's also aligned with the, you know, the WageNet Static Con replan Times Square, where she said we're gonna use a kind of what I call top-up urbanism, where top-down agencies use bottom-up processes. We're just gonna block it off. We're gonna use cheap materials. We're gonna paint some polka dots. We're gonna put out some lawn chairs. We're gonna see what happens. So one of the things that cities have done is they've used those informal urbanism practices to test the taking back of public space. And that has happened in ways that, you know, would not have happened otherwise, because I think people are resistant. They're resistant to giving up lanes and parking spaces and all of that. So that I think has been an opportunity to do tests, right? To do some kind of tactical tests of what we could do in the city. The I'm not sure that it's, when I talk about social productivity, I'm also talking about social equity. And maybe you're referring to that as well. So a couple of my critiques of what's happened in the pandemic have been the fact that a lot of those things have happened in wealthy neighborhoods, right? It have been places where people have put pressure on the city to do projects that provide more public space. And the neighborhoods that have been waiting for potentially years or decades for infrastructure projects to happen, they've just been skipped over. So that pressure needs to come back to say, well, we've been waiting for this infrastructure upgrade for all this time. How do we get to the top of the list? I don't know. I'm looking at some younger groups of activists who are in particular thinking about the highway expansions that are still happening. And there's one in Portland happening now. A group of like 15 to 18-year-olds are saying like, this is not where we want our investment to go. We want our investments to go in increased bike lanes and safer pedestrian spaces. The Vision Zero report for LA came out recently, or the conversation around Vision Zero, and bike and pedestrian fatalities have gone up, not down. And I think many cities are seeing that since the pandemic. People are driving faster, they're driving more recklessly, they're driving more distracted. So, a lot of those kind of conversations about how do we get roads to be safer and drivers to be safer, like that's kind of a precursor to the autonomous vehicle conversation, which is, a technological leap ahead. So I think we're talking about things we weren't talking about. And I think we have kind of cracked that resistance to shifting the status quo in ways that we didn't before. So I think that's good. We still have to fight to get those benefits more equally distributed.
Thank you.
Do we have any last questions from our community?
Anyone out there who recognized their work wants to say, hey, I did that. Your names
Linda,
are all in the book.
I do have a question. If there's Dan, were you leaning towards the computer to speak? I recognize that gesture, so go ahead, Dan.
Sinister gesture. I'm going to go back to Arlie's point about the increased value of your house by the light rail. I lived in Phoenix for a long time, and Phoenix is developing housing all over the place, and light rail has been very successful. But it's getting to the point where just people can't afford all that stick-built housing that lines the light rail. They simply can't afford it. And I'm just wondering, and I'm sure, that they're looking outside the city to find something that's affordable, even though that's getting more difficult. So I'm wondering if you're seeing any trend, particularly related to this, pandemic question about people moving out of the city and the kind of developments that might occur, less expensive properties just outside or in the exurbs of the city.
Yeah, I don't study housing. There are a lot of people who focus on housing specifically. Yeah. So they're going to know a lot more than I do about housing. But I will say, a couple of things. I don't know if the modern streetcar had anything to do with that rise of my house on University.
I'm sure it didn't decrease the value. So
maybe now. But I think, the price of housing is just insane. And, when I talk to people who are dealing more with those questions and the conversation around what kind of housing do we need to build, I have developed a very controversial and unfounded theory, which is that we don't have a housing problem, we have a resource distribution problem, right? We have a lot of housing, but a lot of the square footage is in the hands of too few people. So we have a lot of people who have bought a lot of, like in West Hollywood. West Hollywood is going through downzoning. So we have two duplexes and quads that are being torn down to build, what I keep calling the McModerns, which are the modern versions of the McMansions. So they're generic super large houses, single family houses. So we lose units that way and therefore increase the price per house. But on the other hand, LA is doing some amazing things around accessory dwelling units and higher density lot building. And those kinds of solutions are great. And, you know, some places are outlawing single family zoning. So those kinds of changes that are going to allow for incremental density are really nice solutions to provide such a wide range of alternatives. You know, I don't think that just building any single type of housing is going to be the trick. And I also don't think that separating people out by their economic strata is the answer. You know, so we know that that doesn't result in diverse, equitable communities.
I've just noticed in other areas like in New York, where the central city has been basically gentrified, and that people are moving to the suburbs who can't afford, and that's what's going on.
So I will say something about the drive to qualify, right? Which is what you're talking about, which is, you know, you just keep going further and further and further out till you can afford something. And I've had those of you who were in my studio in Tucson, and I think there's a couple of people in here, I think we talked about this. So there's a thing called, and Arlie teaches his students this, I'm sure, the H+T, right? Which is the housing plus transportation figure. So housing, if you spend less than 30% of your income on housing, that's considered affordable. You know, we've been looking at who in Los Angeles is spending less than 30% of their income on housing. And it's, you know, it's like such a tiny sliver of the population. But the H+T index says there's housing plus transportation. And I don't know what that figure is, Arlie. It's what, like 45% maybe?
Up to 50, say.
So say up to 50%. So then you're taking into account, it's not just your house costs, like gas here is $5 a gallon. If I'm paying to drive from my suburban house to my job, and I'm not taking that into account, and I'm just thinking about my house price, well, then I'm not actually factoring in the entire cost. So the other one is utilities. And this was my idea. Like we talked about this years ago. Like, why aren't we thinking H+T+U? Because the reality is also that there are some places where you're paying a whole lot for utilities for all kinds of reasons, and you're not taking that into account. So I think in terms of how we think about housing, we're very narrowly thinking about housing as the box within which we live, not the communities and the conditions that make up our quality of life.
Naya has a follow-up question. New question.
Yeah, so I just had a question, I guess, as a student very early on in school, it's hard to fathom how you can push for change in some of these things that require a lot of political assistance, I guess, in order to get them there. Like here in Tucson alone, homelessness in 2019 to 2020 has risen about 60%, if I remember correctly. And that's a big number. And it's hard to know where to push for change and how to go about that, especially when Tucson's had such a history of promoting urban sprawl. If you go back to kind of the way the city planning came to be and where it is now. So I guess from someone further along in career, what do you think a good route would be? I guess other than just the typical activism, if you have anything to recommend.
I don't know, what degree are you getting?
Bachelor of Architecture right now.
I wholeheartedly support interdisciplinary degrees. I think, so at WashU, we have the opportunity for our master's students to do dual degrees. And so you can get a master's in architecture and a master's of urban design. You can get a master's in architecture and landscape architecture. You can get a master's in landscape architecture and urban design. And I think the value of that, well, it broadens your job opportunities for one. You know, we see a lot of success with our students who want to kind of work across scales. It also allows you to work in places, firms or cities where they're doing design research and research as a form of change. So the more you can know about a variety of things, the more influence I think you have. So I have an architecture degree. I started as an architect, I started in practice, and once I started teaching, I never stayed within my lane, right? I was always, I developed a curriculum called Architecture as Activism. I developed a curriculum called the Mobile Studio. When I went back to school, I got a PhD in urban planning. And architects were not thinking about social justice. I mean, they're still just barely thinking about social justice, and they are still just kind of barely thinking about the environment, even though they're better than they used to be. And I love my architects. Like I you know, it's still my kind of my home base. So, but there's a lot more to know. The other thing is, like, I wasn't interested in just being able to influence one site at a time. Seemed much more important to me to be able to influence larger interconnected systems. So I'm a proponent of the interdisciplinary and or multiple dual degrees. Just a couple more years. And Amanda seconds that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I also had another question because I'm actually from Las Vegas as well.
Yeah.
So I'm relatively familiar with both of the housing markets here and there. And both of them have increased astronomically as time has gone on. And I was just wondering if you had any data that was pertinent to the amount of people moving from California. I know in both cities, I've heard quite a few people complaining about the amount of Californians that are moving in, and just how many of those people that are moving here, do you have any figures on how many of them are coming for affordability reasons?
I don't. I imagine there's information out there, but you are right. When there are people moving out of these high market environments into more affordable markets, and they are influencing the affordability or lack of in those markets. That is true. You know, Portland and Seattle said that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. You know, Oregon looked down to California and complained. Now we're hearing it from Austin, Raleigh, North Carolina, Tucson. I mean, that's probably why my house is worth $600,000. I don't know. I never owned that house, by the way. I just rented. But yeah, there is an out migration. You know, it was interesting during the pandemic. I had friends who lived in New York, and of course, lots of people left New York, and the rents went down. A lot of people renegotiated their rents, but word today was that rents went up another 20-25% since then in the last 6 months. So, you know, one thing to keep in mind, and this is one of my takeaways about optimism, is it's a pendulum. It doesn't go only in one direction, and neither does housing, even though we've always been taught to believe that the value of housing always goes up, and people do say that. Yes and no. So, you know, 2000s, the recession was a housing bubble, right? That's what happened. We had a major drop in housing. Is that going to happen again? I have no idea. I mean, but it does feel artificially inflated to me. Again, not my area of expertise.